right, so we're into the meat of the course now, Out of the Silent Planet. Been setting things up for this by looking at Frankenstein and First Men in the Moon by Wells, and finally looking at some of Lewis's own essays. And it struck me, I should have mentioned that last semester, the last lecture I gave for the Lewis class, I looked at some of the other essays, and they would have been relevant as well, in particular his essay on transposition. Because I think transposition, which is a sort of an explanation for what Lewis seeks to do in his fiction, which is to transpose upwards rather than the tendency of fiction to transpose downwards or to reduce everything to a materialist worldview, a common denominator, a lowest common denominator at that, and so to find motivations for things like the highest human ideals in terms of love, to find them in base human desires like lust or just mere procreation and so forth. It's not that there's no connection, it's that everything is reductionistic. And that sort of reductionism is true across the board. And one of the ways in which Lewis is going to, both Lewis and Tolkien are going to address this is through the process of what he calls transposition. And so it contradicts what I said in the epilogue to the discarded image. He sees that, and I'll quote, I read it last time, it's involved with a change of models. So it's connected with cosmology, and cosmology becomes important here because, actually I should light that up again. I've put it up on the board 1,000 times behind me, but actually it just occurred to me that it's useful here. Along with a change in cosmology or astronomy, we also find that there's a whole change in worldview across the board. A sort of a paradigm shift in the way everything's regarded. And he describes it in these terms. This is page 220. He says the change of models did not only involve astronomy alone, it involved also in biology the change, arguably more important, from a devolutionary to an evolutionary scheme. I talked about that last time. From a cosmology in which it was axiomatic, that is, it took for granted, it was the first principle here, that all perfect things precede all imperfect things, to one in which the opposite is true. It is axiomatic that, quote, the starting point or the Entwicklungsgrund is always lower than that which is developed. So again, the caveman, which is lower, will precede the philosopher and the theologian and then the scientist. And so there are different accounts of anthropology that will recount this. That humanity itself is said to develop from the lowest to the highest, but the lowest is in a sense the most human, and the highest is moving to another category of being altogether. And that's one of the questions here, is what is that future being which we're evolving into going to be characterized by? And I think the answer from First Man in the Moon, which is this, Wells's sci-fi novel there, is basically cosmic evolutionism. It's evolution pushed into the cosmos. That's what he's doing there. It's going to evolve in the direction of ever larger brains and ever less bodily beings. So a spirit rather than body. And so within that, there's something of the old heresy of ancient heresy of Gnosticism, which held that human beings in their fundamental nature were spiritual beings and their bodies were like a prison house for their souls. So that's the ancient view of Plato and basically the entire pagan world. And pretty much actually you'd find the same thing in Eastern religions as well. So our nature is spiritual and it is non-bodily. The body is in a sense at best a prison house for the soul. At worst it's a contradiction to our spirits. And this is why they will permit suicide, among other things, because bodies don't matter. It'll also not provide a hedge against promiscuity per se, because again, the body's not really me. But the main point is the shift in models shifts from the idea of the perfect becoming imperfect to as a devolution to the imperfect becoming more and more perfect. And we in the scientific era are at the crest of that evolution, and so we can't really learn from the past other than that's what we're leaving behind. And that includes planet Earth. So I think that's something of the rationale of writing science fiction for Lewis and what makes him take interest in it. I will say, very broadly speaking, Tolkien and Lewis, and I've said this already, are interested in pretty much the same thing. Although and I've argued already that Lewis's interest in science fiction is in the realm of the fantastic, and the very same sort of things that he would read about in medieval literature, in Spencer's. So the allegories of fantastic beings, etc., the same sorts of things that we find in Tolkien, they have the same interests. And they choose to come at the problems with modern literature, their own age, just through a slightly different lens. Lewis deals with it through the problem of space. Tolkien deals with it through the problem of time. Otherwise, it's the same. I think it's very similar. They're addressing the modern world, its materialism, and its tendency to reduce everything to spatial, temporal frameworks. It gets rid of the idea of God, the eternal God, the idea of a mind or a being that stands outside space and time. Everything is reducible to space and time. And it creates certain fundamental contradictions and conflicts there, and they expose that through their fiction. As I say, Lewis does it through looking at space. Tolkien does that through looking at time. Remember, Tolkien's plots are set in the deep, dark past. They never existed, but it's just as fictional as Lewis's suppositions. But Lewis is engaging more specifically and quite obviously with Wells's work. Any comments or questions so far? No. Okay. But this was a sort of an agreement, and it was made between them. It's very similar to what Wordsworth and Coleridge did in their lyrical ballads. One would come from the natural perspective, namely Wordsworth. The other would come from a supernatural perspective, namely Coleridge. But both men would be talking about the supernatural and the natural together. They want to talk about both. So for Wordsworth, when he writes about nature, he's suggesting that there's something more than the material in nature. There's something transcendent in the natural. So he imbues it with a sense of the divine. And whereas Coleridge, if you know his works at all, like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or Christabel or anything of that sort, is dealing with more horror type scenarios, just like Frankenstein is. And so one scholar calls it natural supernaturalism, M.H. Abrams, to describe the two. I think that Tolkien and Lewis are doing something like that, but they're trying to make it more orthodox, more Christian. I don't think that Tolkien, or rather Wordsworth and Coleridge, are nearly as careful with such matters, and invite pantheism in their works, which you don't get in these two, at least if you're reading it carefully. So they agree on this. We're going to come at it from opposite angles, but we're going to deal with more or less the same problems that we observe in modern fiction. And they are trying to challenge their contemporaries in this. And what are we going to do then in our fiction? Well, they're going to combine a love of history. They both love history. And the significance of history. I think it's meaningful. This is a Christian point of view, by the way. Eastern religions posit no meaning or significance to history whatsoever. Remember, it's what you do in your body. Doesn't matter. Think in spiritual realms. Think of yourself in a disembodied form. History matters to Christian because the incarnation is the pivot point in Christian history. God becomes man, it now can no longer be doubted that God has interest in human affairs. It's already not in doubt when you look at the Old Testament. We're told about Israel and the significance of the nation of Israel and what it does and so forth. Very specifically, clearly historical. But come the incarnation, it's so important that God himself takes on a human body, lives a human life, dies a human death, and just simply rises from it. There's the thing that's a little different. But history matters. They want to debate those that defend the modern world, like Wells. And they want to point out all of the foibles and contradictions of their way of viewing. And they want to avoid propaganda, which they think is characteristic of their age. Remember, they're writing in the context of the First World War, which they fought in, the Second World War, of which they viewed an intensification and propaganda from both sides. And they want to cast a vision which, unlike their contemporaries, is not so bleak and desperate, in which human life becomes basically futile. When you read Lewis and Tolkien, I think that you are energized and get a sense that there's something good and beautiful and true here, which I want to be true, even if it's not true. And in a sense, part of me thinks that they're making a contemporary commentary in this, which I think they are, by the way. Just like H.G. Wells was in his science fiction, in his cosmic evolutionism, he's promoting a certain view of evolutionism in the future. Lewis is presenting his cultural commentary on how things ought to be on planet Earth as well, and Tolkien for that matter. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second is that in the case of both men, unlike Huxley, unlike George Orwell, they don't think that the primary problem in the modern world is politics, or even propaganda per se. So H.G. Wells writes a work dealing with propaganda. It's very good, on the politics of the English language. I encourage everyone to read it. It's very interesting. And you remember in 1984, there's such a thing as thought crime, ministries of truth, which are actually propaganda, ministry of love, which is actually punishment, and so forth. So everything is flipped, inverted. People take that to be a commentary on either fascism or communism, possibly both, but totalitarian government, which we tend to associate with politics. And likewise, Huxley's doing the same sort of thing in Brave New World. He seems to be more interested, however, in the biopolitics. If you remember Brave New World, there's prenatal conditioning and so forth, conditioning people even before they're born. Never mind after. Let's get to it early so that we can bring about the cosmic evolutionism which H.G. Wells is promoting. Right? We're gonna further evolution by doing what the Grand Lunar does, which is to create differentiated beings that actually look different than one another because they're made for purpose. So they come at it politically or biopolitically in the case of Huxley, whereas Lewis is more concerned with scientism. Not politics, but a certain, it's not science, it's scientism. And I think I probably should say something about scientism. Lewis writes about it more than once. But there is a relation between science and culture which scientism promotes, which Lewis is very concerned about. And it basically claims three things. One, that science provides a view that refutes Christianity. It refutes it. Science has abolished the need for religion at all. It's part of the progress, right? There was an irrational age where poetry abounded, Homer, etc. Then we came to the philosophers, and there was a philosophical age. And then we came to the age of the theologians, and that gave way to the realm of the scientists. And at each successive stage, the stage before it became more or less redundant. So science has effectively made traditional religion redundant. Secondly, the claim that if you are opposed to the claims of the scientists, that you're anti-science. That might sound familiar. If you're skeptical of certain claims that scientists make in the name of science by appealing to science, you're not observing that they're making an appeal to the thing that they have yet to demonstrate, and they're claiming as scientists often metaphysical things that lie outside of their discipline, even though they have no ability to even discern that they're doing that. But you will immediately be branded as anti-science for doing so. And thirdly, that public policy ought to be led by these scientific experts. They ought to guide it, they ought to control it. Now, the figure that I mentioned that advanced this in a way which is I'm grateful for in its clarity is B.F. Skinner, the conditioner, famous psychologist of conditioning. Remember, he wrote that work Beyond Freedom and Dignity, in which he attacks C.S. Lewis as the foremost exponent of the literatures of freedom and dignity. He believes the idea of human freedom is a myth that is an impediment to human progress, because it requires, among other things, a certain ethical boundary, like the doctrine of informed consent, the Nuremberg Code. Why would you have to agree to an experiment being done upon you? Because your freedom is a part of your nature, and we don't want to violate that, because if we violate your freedom to do that, we're violating you. And there's a dignity to human life as it is created. Again, that's an impediment to the scientific conditioners. Skinner writes that in 1970. Lewis is dead. I wonder if he would have dared to have written it while he was living. That would have been interesting. I would have enjoyed that. Anyway, he didn't. But he did mention Lewis very specifically. B.F. Skinner, famous psychologist, I think he was at Harvard University, most influential psychologist of his day. And his influence continues to this day. Again, to pull it out of Lewis's context and push it more into ours, still a question within the realm of psychology: what is the discipline actually study? It's the psyche. What is the psyche? Is it the mind? Is it the soul? Is it the brain? What is the psyche? If you're a materialist, you think it's the brain, in which case it's a biochemical thing. If you're leaning towards the more traditional heresy that I noted, regarded the human nature to be in your mind or your soul, but not your body, then you're going to incline to a more spiritual explanation. But in either case, you're going to separate the two and see that they're contrary to one another. This is really important for Lewis's discussion in the sci-fi trilogy. He's going to come to that from different angles. The first, each of the sci-fi novels is going to deal with a different problem. Same people dealing with different forms of a similar problem. So in this one, I'll come to it in a bit. But those are the tenets of scientism. And there's this quote regarding that, which I want to read to you. After his conversion, by the way, he was skeptical of it even before his conversion. So here's a quote. 1925, he writes to his father, saying that philosophy showed that the scientists and the materialists have not had the last word. Philosophy shows that. Even philosophy. He's not speaking from a religious point of view. Just from a purely philosophical vantage point, it's abundantly clear that the scientists and the materialists who operate in the name of science, appealing to scientism, haven't had the last word. So there's something more to be said. After he's converted, 1932, he writes to his brother, and a claim in a publication that science had debunked religion. And this is characteristic of scientism, I said. And he writes this, and it's a comment, he's quoting somebody else. I don't know who the somebody else is. And here's the quote: "A priest is a man who disseminates little lies in defense of a great truth. And a scientist is a man who disseminates little truths in defense of a great lie." Isn't that interesting? It's the grand lie. Well, what's the grand lie? It's the narrative that I talked about last time under the title of the essay is The Funeral of a Great Myth. It's the grand lie. Evolutionism is a wonderful fiction. He thinks it's the greatest fiction that has ever been invented by man, but it is just that. It's a big lie. And there are little truths to try and defend it. Anyway, and there's something about science then that is quasi-magical. And he comes to this repeatedly, this idea of the coalition and the similarity between the scientist and the magician, such that the first book in Narnia is called The Magician's Nephew. And who's it talking about? Uncle Andrew, who's a scientist. And he says that the two are effectively twins. So they have key similarities. They also have significant differences. And both of them, both science and magic, can function as alternatives to religion. So for anyone who thinks that Lewis is promoting magic, because Aslan appeals to the deep magic, right? So it sounds something like that, but there's a deep magic. It's not quite like this. So there's an analogy to be made, but it's so much infinitely greater that the witch can't even understand it. If the witch could understand the deeper magic, she would know that, etc. If she just looked back a little bit further, she would have seen that. And you will see that throughout. And again, when we come to the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, one of the Istari, seems like, and he's called a wizard. And he seems to have powers that transcend natural powers. But on the other hand, are they actually magic in the sense of traditional magic? I don't think so, because magic, in both Lewis and Tolkien's perspective, is forbidden in Scripture, first of all, because it's witchcraft, and you're doing something occultish. That's not what's going on with Gandalf. Nor will it be what Ransom will do in his works. Anyway, but we'll come to that. But the fatal contradiction of evolutionism is this. Quoting Lewis, "If my own mind is a product of the irrational," so if I really have evolved from the or the primal slime, like the amoeba, and I've evolved from the amoeba on upward to more and more advanced form of life. But if it began in irrationality, like the beasts, if my own mind is a product of the irrational, if what seem my clearest reasonings are only the way in which a creature conditioned as I am, which is what B.F. Skinner says of us, is bound to feel, how shall I trust my mind when it tells me about evolution? Is it really a clear, rational, purely scientific theory? Can I trust it when it comes to those conclusions and claims to be scientific and beyond dispute if you're into scientism? If you're Richard Dawkins, who, again, mocks Christians. By the way, even Darwin had similar doubts about the core problem with the theory of evolution as such. And it's the blind acceptance, though, that really worries him, that scientism seems to have a an effect on the populace such that they want to be deceived. A scientific elite is going to protect you from all harms. Just give up your freedoms, and we'll take care of you. And people do. He notes it in his age. The eugenicists appeal to these. And as the public generally defers to science, they become more willing to accept what the scientists say. If the scientists say it, then they must know best. It was used under COVID, that same appeal. Whatever you think of it, that's exactly what the politicians said. I'm just going to defer to the chief doctor. As if the chief doctor's claims couldn't be scrutinized, questioned, or even regarded as contradictory or false. It could not be. Well, that's aside from the specifics of the case, that is the product of a scientific mindset, the acceptance of claims just because those in charge who are scientists say that it's so. So there's a reductionism, and it threatens, in Lewis's view and Tolkien's view, and it's particularly well presented in Tolkien because there, the War of the Ring seems like the whole of the earth is going to be overcome by evil in the process. That's not there in Lewis to the same degree. So if there's one difference between Lewis and Tolkien, it isn't that, aside from the fact that Lewis does it in space and Tolkien does it in time, it's that Tolkien presents it as really a cataclysmic historical event. The whole of history hangs on this moment. Is all Middle-earth going to fall under the sway of Sauron? But science reduces everything, and we're going to come to this in The Abolition of Man in a couple lectures. And I'm going to quote it, though. He says, as soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, the whole process is stultified by treating human beings as the products of blind, non-rational forces. Scientific reductionism eliminates man as a rational moral agent. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. So whenever we're saying we're making advances, we're gaining power over nature, and we're reducing human beings to nature, at the end of that, we get rid of the one thing that is different between us and the rest of nature, which is that we have a rational moral nature, and we really have abolished man. That's the grand threat. And scientists operating under the delusion of scientism are doing exactly this thing. Comments or questions before I get to the novel itself more specifically?